Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. Ironically, I do not drink coffee or alcohol, so all I've got is Kriegsspiel for you today, which is perfectly fine. Today, we're going to talk about some fun topics, maneuver, recon, and force concentration, a few other things. Way back when, towards the end of last year in October, Marshall had questioned the IKS audience for topics that they'd like discussed, and some that were thrown out very early on in October, November covered these topics. So I'm kind of grouping them together, going to try and cover them all as one. And so, wish me luck. What I do want to do before we get into that, though, is someone had a bright idea to kind of highlight what's going on in the past week. Games that have ended, games that are beginning. So I'm going to attempt to do that without having prepped very well. So in terms of games that have ended, LTD's Galactic Empires game ended, I know, because I lost in it. And there's another one that ended, and I'm trying to remember which it was now. There's another one I lost, and now I don't even remember. Oh, it's Crisis in Saxony, that's right. Wolfton's game also came to at least a partial conclusion. I think so. It was a play-by-post, and I think he has plans to do a live game to finish out the rest of it. I'm not sure, but I also lost that one, so we're not going to talk about it anymore. Those are the ones I know of. There's maybe a few games that I'm not in that also ended. In terms of games that started, okay, so we had a few live games occur. We had two games on Saturday, in fact, and I am looking up the history of them. 1 second. So Dave Pumphouse ran a game. It was for Americans. It was very early. I think it started 4 a.m. at least my time. For the Europeans, more reasonable, which is fine. But he ran a game. ARP helped him. It's called the Battle of Gloucester, I believe, which had 10 players, and I think went very well. I wasn't in it. I think it went well, so that's fun. Also, Jan ran a game yesterday, the Battle Altenkirchen. I think it was part of the Connections online events going on. So that's fun. And then I know Otto has been on a whirlwind tour recently, running like a game a day. I think he had one Friday, one yesterday, and one today even. So he must have more time and not be as busy in school or something, because he's running a lot of games, and his games are always fun. So I recommend to be in one of his if you haven't yet. Let's go to recruitment. You know what? I could actually show you what I'm looking at. At least for recruitment, I can. And see what games there are. So this one was literally just announced 10 minutes ago. King Com, I think him and Hobbs are hosting a new diplomacy game. They ran the Iberia 1066 game, which was a lot of fun. And so it looks like they're starting up a new one with 15 teams. So props to them if they get through the end. That's a lot, but good for them. That's a play-by-post. Let's see. Wolfton has a game today live in 3 hours. The missile diplomacy test. That should be interesting. I don't even know. Obviously it involves missiles, but I don't know more than that. And then Otto. Oh, this was about his game. Sorry. Marshall has announced the Grand Sekigahara. So he and Liam and a few others have been running a play-by-post kind of diplomacy game set in medieval Japan. That is drawing to a conclusion, and I think they're going to wrap up that play-by-post game with this live game, which should be fun. So looking forward to that. I'm going to go back a little bit I guess we'll go back for the whole week. We had quite a few game postings. So, Lafondios has posted as a very funny game, or fun idea. So the premise is the admins of the IKS have left for different reasons, and now the players in this game are basically running the Kriegsspiel Society and having to make decisions and stuff. Um, Very interesting idea. We'll see what comes of it. I will say that the idea to cover what's going on and coming up actually came from that game. Someone had the idea to do that as one of their actions, and I said that's a good idea, and so now I'm doing it. LTD is hosting a new play-by-post game, very unique and quirky. It involves glaciers sliding across ice with penguins on them and throwing snowballs, and seals lobbing giant snowballs and stuff like that. I'm in that one. Not started yet, but it looks to be fun. So very interesting. KB's, this is a request for more people. I don't know if he still needs people, but probably. His very large, him and Dogpilot, their very large Beggars of Glory game featuring battles all across Europe in 1796. I'm in that one on the French side, and it is a blast. So if you're not in that yet, join it. I think they're looking for more politicians in particular. Popasemi is running a game in the Alien universe. It's a play-by-post game, and I don't know more about that. So if that interests you, do that. And then I guess I can put a plug in. On May 3rd, I have a live game. We're going to be doing the Battle of Scarif to celebrate Star Wars Day on May the 4th. And I think that brings us back about a week. And then Tan's running a Blitz game. We'll go that far. So lots of games going on. Happy to see all sorts of play-by-post and live games happening. I'm going to check the audience real fast, see who's here. Oh, so Otto's here. Welcome, Otto. Birdie. For some reason I can't, well, I'm in display mode, so I can't see all the names of everyone. So Soul and someone with a T and then a dot, dot, dot. But thanks for listening. Raise your hand if you have any comments. All right, now let's get on to the subject of our topic. So, maneuver, recon, and force concentration. Swick had asked something about, or he wanted to talk about maneuver to contact games and then versus games that start in contact. And, which I guess what's the differences, pros and cons, stuff like that. That one's interesting. I like it. If you notice the games that Marshall runs or highlights, they're often maneuver to contact, and I think that's a lot of what Kriegsspiel is, or was, in that the most important elements are the maneuver, because usually by the time you're in contact and engaged, the battle's often decided at that point. Maybe not fully decided, but as an umpire with a god's eye view, you can kind of see, yeah, this, they got this many units here, this many units here, in such and such position, and you can kind of tell where things are going to go. So it's much more important about where your units are and their positioning, and the maneuver that leads up to that. So I guess some would say the game is pointless if they're already fully engaged and in contact. And to an extent that may be true. But in a lot of my live games on Thursdays, I often start in at least initial contact, because I only have 2.5 hours to play the game. And if I do the full maneuver to contact, I could use up the full 2.5 hours just doing that part. And then the contact part, the players are just barely making contact, and then I got to call a game. And I know as a player that's frustrating, because while it's important, as a player, you want to do the maneuver, and then you want the contact, and you want to play until you can see the enemy routing from before you in the field. You don't want to just barely run into the enemy and then the umpire call the game and say, "Well, it's over, good job," and then say who won, or not even talk about who won. So from a player perspective, I think it's important to at least play partially through the engagement and the contact, just for the fun of it. Um, but when I do it for live games, what I'll usually do is the maneuver part is handled um, in the pre-planning, and so it's there, but it's not done live. And so in this game, for example, in Farmville, what I might do is if the players say, "Okay, I'm on the blue team, and these are my routes of march, and going along these roads, and I'm just drawing here. Let's say these are the 3 roads. They've got 3 brigades or divisions, and those are the roads. Rather than starting the game with everyone here and spending an hour of the game, giving an update. Okay, you're here. Okay, now you're here. Okay, now you're here. Okay, now you're here. Okay, now you're here. Now you're here. That's kind of laborious. Laborious. What I usually do is, okay, if everyone's marching along those routes and nothing's going to change, where would they make first contact? Maybe red team's sending a scouting group up here, and somewhere along this ridge, they spot each other, and that's the first contact of the game. That's where I'll start the game. So this group's in column all along here. Maybe they're in column here, and something like that. But that's really the first point where decisions are being made. Once you're on your route of march. I don't really let them change that route of march. They see the enemy. What do they do with that? That information. Do they deploy? Sorry, I'm keep going back and forth in colors. Do you deploy? Do you turn around? Do you go a different route? The decisions start to get interesting at that point, and that makes it interesting. So I guess it's not fully at contact, but to speed the game along, I just move it along up to that point. Let's see, does that answer the questions? So, what else can I say about that? So the maneuver part is really interesting because it's all about with the very strong fog of war element that Kriegsspiel has. You don't know where the enemy is, and as a commander, you're dealing with pieces of information and trying to puzzle them together, and make sense out of it. And it's a lot of fun as you're maneuvering across a battlefield and trying to find where the enemy is and where they're concentrated. And as I said, that really is Kriegsspiel figuring that out. Oh, we got a huge audience now. KB, Dog Pilot, welcome. Achilles, Michael Gore, Seal Wearing something. Welcome. Raise your hands if you have any comments. I know Achilles is going to have comments later. Sooner or later, he'll have something to say, especially about force concentration. So yeah, the maneuver part is fun because it's about finding where your enemy is, and then bringing your army to bear, ideally in a way that's better than the enemy has. So let's move on to that. So Eli Gray, when he was making suggestions, let me erase these lines. He talked about he wanted to talk about maneuver, troop placement, considerations of space to move around in, application of force, and economy of force, and proper exchange of information. There's a lot there. And Whitford had asked to talk about force concentration, more importantly, the economy of force. He mentioned it's one of the things players fail at, and that he said too many players in an information vacuum end up either attacking a superior enemy force or committing much of their force against a negatable one. And then Jeremy talked about recon, the importance of recon and how it's often neglected in games. And then finally, Lafondios talked about center of gravity. And maneuvering to attack or disrupt an enemy center of gravity. So all those are very much related. And let's talk about recon first, because I think that leads into it. And this is as much for players as it is for umpires and game design, because I think where we have failures on any of those elements, it's often the way the umpires have designed the game or are running the game that doesn't reward that. So let's talk about recon first. In a typical game, let's say you got 3 or 4 players. You got your starting camp. The enemy is somewhere over here, and let's say your orders are just to find and battle them. Often your army will have some kind of recon element, some cavalry force, if we're talking about Civil War, Napoleonic warfare. And you'll want to use that for reconnaissance. If it's American Civil War, all your cavalry are basically reconnaissance, or should be. If it's Napoleonic, you've got your hussars or chasseurs, your light cavalry. And so you'll want to split them up and have them taking different roads. Now let's use this map as an example. So this is the battle. This is Farmville. We actually ran a battle here. So I'm gonna just highlight, because it's kind of hard to see, the main roads on this map. Yeah, let's see. There's a road here, and then a road about right there, something like that. Now, if you're the red commander, it would be wise to send your cavalry ahead on all, look where the main roads are, where the enemy would be, or the main avenues they could be coming at you from, and send your cavalry on those roads. Have them go do the recon. That's really important to give you a heads up of where the enemy's at and what's going on. And then you start to get information. So as a umpire, you want to reward those efforts and give the player lots of information. Often in Kriegsspiel, when umpires give the fog of war, they do that by giving too little information, and it's easy to do it that way. That's why we do it that way. But realistically, if we were better, we would be giving too much information, and it would be conflicting. So, when I read accounts of George Washington in the Battle of Brandywine, he hears news of, he's got scouts out there, and they're constantly getting spooked, and so maybe they see scouts, or maybe they see cavalry or something, and they send a report and say, "Oh, the army's coming this way," but then he'll receive another scout report, and they're saying the exact same thing 10 miles away from them. So which one does he believe? He doesn't know for sure, and that's the hard part. Is often you have so much information and a lot of it conflicting that you don't know what to believe, and that creates its own fog of war. That's kind of an aside. So, I remember my thought. So one thing is, I think ARP complains about this, is often if you look at accounts of how detailed some scouting reports were, they could be very detailed, and I think umpires often aren't as detailed as they would have been historically. And so one thing umpires can do is be better on the information that you're giving the player. You don't want to give them the whole picture, because that just eliminates the fog of war. You wouldn't say, this cavalry unit ran into an army here, and here's the exact force composition, order of battle, everything. A scout would likely know that. But they would, count the troops that they see, give it an information what kind of troops they are, where they're going, what they're doing, who they, what flags they're bearing, who they're reporting to, or what division or corps they're part of, that kind of information. And then the players that are receiving that can use that information. Because the fun part of it is, as you're marching to contact, you're getting all this information from everywhere. You're trying to put a picture of the enemy position. We're making this fake battle here. Let's say blue has, okay, we'll do the game that we ran this last Thursday. So the blue Union Army started in Farmville. They had twice the strength of the Confederate Army, which was camped here. But in this example, the Confederate Army had a huge advantage in that they had a balloon and could see the whole battlefield. But the Blue Army sent, I think they had I can see it here, 4 brigades in the division, and they sent either 2 or 3 of the 4 along these roads to start. And they were the Union was a little bit worried at first, so I think they deployed the rest here just north of Farmville to guard against the river. So to start with, they're going this way. The Confederates didn't know that. Now they had a balloon, which helped tremendously. Let's say they didn't have a balloon. So their recon elements. Actually, I'm going to change the scenario just for the example I'm giving. Let's say they send a small recon force that way just to see it's there, but the main force is to the south. So the Confederates, as their recon elements are out, they're going to spot, oh, here's a column here maybe and a column here. Hopefully they catch them both. And if they're sent cavalry along all the roads I just talked about, they're going to kind of run into all three close to the same time. And if they get good recon reports, then the Confederate commander can say, okay, the main thrust of the Union march is here. So this is where they're concentrated. This is their center of gravity. And so with that information, you can make a decision, and he can, whatever forces he has here, he can decide how to deploy. Where's the best place to deploy to defend them? In the game, they're trying to protect this bridge here, so they kind of deployed here and dug in. But they could have made some other interesting decisions. What if they know they're coming east, and they were able to, maybe they send something here in the woods here. I always love a good ambush, so send something to hide in the woods here, wait for them to pass, and then pop out and hit them in the flank or rear. That would be kind of fun. But once you have that information, you can decide what to do about it. All right, I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to check the comments or raised hands. We got Emmanuel Diwali, welcome. Sheephead. Someone with a V that I can't read, sorry. Thanks for listening to my rantings. So once you know where the enemy is concentrated, you can decide what to do with that information, how you counteract. So if you know it's just a recon force there, you don't need to send much that way to slow them down, maybe nothing at all, or just something to watch the bridge maybe. Which that then leads into economy of force. So let's say, they're coming, the Union Blue has deployed in a line, and they're advancing this way, something like that. How much of your force do you commit as a Confederate? It's called the economy of force. So you don't want to overcommit your force because you don't have them for other things if you need it. And that's something that I think we're getting better at all the time. It's something that I struggle with, is that if I send, in my games, let's say he commits these units to the fight, usually, historically and realistically, once you commit units to a fight, they're kind of spoken for the day. It's very difficult to get them to disengage. And let's say, for the sake of saying it, let's say blue is super sneaky. So the night before, they sent this long flanking march all the way along the edge of the map, across this bridge, kind of like the British did it several times. But something crazy like that, like this force that left at 11 p.m., they're doing this long march, and they're about to come in on the top of the Confederate camp. Now, the Confederates may not even know this, but there's always things like that that can happen. And so you want to have reserves so that when that force shows up in your rear, if you have everything, if you made the nice longest line that Marshall likes to talk about, so this line cannot be flanked because it goes from the river to the edge of the map. It's nice and pretty. You've committed all your reserves. There's no way they can get around you. It's a bit of a meme. Nobody actually does that anymore. Everyone's pretty good about it. But let's say you've done that, and then someone comes to your rear. Good rules and good umpiring would not allow a player to very easily pull back your men and reposition them to face the oncoming threat. There would be a lot of friction and difficulty in doing that. And so, as a player and an umpire, or I guess as a player first of all, you want to have reserves, so you have options. And so you really want to commit I can't remember where I said it. I remember seeing a Kriegsspiel or ICAST discussion about it. Is a lot of the battles were really about committing the least amount of force necessary to win, and so the commanders were constantly playing a game of, how much does the enemy have? How much do I need to commit to win? Because the less you have to commit, the more options you keep for later for things the unexpected things that come up. Now, obviously, you don't want to commit too little that uh, you lose the fight just because you didn't commit everything. So there's a balance there, and it's tricky. But you do want to keep reserves. So if you got your line committed here, you want good reserves. That way, if this giant flanking force shows up in your rear unexpectedly, you can quickly commit those men who until then had just been standing around to go and stop them, and then you see what you do next. Or let's say you got your reserves there, and the enemy in a other scenario, which is likely, if your line starts to break in pieces, if you don't have any reserves, then they can exploit those gaps, and all of a sudden you're getting outflanked everywhere, and you'll quickly dissolve. And so you need those reserves to move in and plug the gaps as you're fighting. So I guess that was a rant about reserves and economy of force. So part of all the comments that I saw was, hold on one second, I gotta turn the fan. It's getting hot in here. Was about the information the players have and how do they know how much the enemy has, and being able to make decisions about how much force to commit. And I think that's on the umpires. I think the umpires need to make sure that they are giving the players enough information that they can make those kinds of decisions at a reasonable level. A player isn't going to know everything, but they should have a good idea, especially if they've been maneuvering and doing reconnaissance and sizing up the enemy. By the time they get to where they're engaged, they should have a fairly good idea of what they're up against, and they can make decisions accordingly. Now, obviously, there's still that fog of war, and some element of even historical battles is armies would hide their forces or do tricky things to keep forces hidden and away from the enemy. But generally, you want players to have enough information that they can make reasonable decisions about how much forces to commit. Because if you're just fighting blind, it's just no fun. You're like, well, I don't have any information to make a decision, so I'd probably attack because that's more fun. But the players aren't going to be committed because it's not meaningful to them. They don't have enough information to decide one way or the other, so they're just going to do whatever and not really care. And so as an umpire, you have to be careful about whether it's visual in the screenshot they get or written in the updates or verbal in the updates they're getting. They should have enough information to make some kind of decision that they can feel good about. So that's on the umpire to think about. I'm going to check comments. So Achilles said the rule of thumb is to make contact with the smallest force possible. Yeah, thank you. Sheephead said, I think a lot of new players, including me in my first one or two games, made the mistake of thinking that reserves are intended just for reacting to unexpected things. The realization that the reserves are actually what wins battles, not the first echelon, and most of the time not the second either, is really important, I think. Yeah, that's a very good point. Because as a commander, think about Napoleon, and he'd sit there with his 5 corps, whatever, given a battle. He would commit his forces, and really for him, there's only so many decisions that Napoleon made on the day of the battle, and often it was stuff like, okay, first corps, you're going in now, and that was his decision. He'd kind of tell them where and when to commit, and then the rest was on the corps commander, and Napoleon was done. And so in terms of his, as the commander general, his decision making, all he could really control was his forces and when and where they are committed. And so that's why you often find that he kept the Imperial Guard with him to the very end, and often sometimes didn't even commit them into the battle because he needed to keep that option um, and flexibility, because once he committed a corps to the fight, is basically done. He wasn't going to be able to call it back that day and then redeploy it elsewhere. It would just take too long to do. Um, and so what he would do in a battle, let's make this just a fictional Napoleonic battle. So let's say there's a fight. We're just going to say a big grand fight here versus the forces of red. And Napoleon's here. He's got his own 4 corps fighting against them. And then he's kept the Imperial Guard here in reserve. And that's all he's got. He would monitor the fight throughout the day. And then if he's getting reports of, hey, this one's weak, we're going to, I'm just making this up now, but let's say this is where they're weak. Everyone else is okay. They're holding or fighting or doing well, but the enemy's falling back here. He said, okay, I know we're winning the fight. I think this is where the enemy is weakest, so he can commit the Imperial Guard to a big attack here at the end of the day, and it's enough to break them, send them routing, and with that force routing, this force routes, and then this force routes, and he wins the battle. So that's kind of how it played out historically, and so as an umpire, you want to design games and reward movement and flexibility and or the lack of flexibility. I think often in my games, this is included, I'm continually trying to improve this. I make it too easy for players to change their mind or do different things. So let's say Commander Dubose here has units, and they're deployed in line or something like that. Sometimes a player will say, okay, I want, they're deployed in line, they're ready to fight. He says, okay, I want to go northeast, we need to march. And as an umpire, there's a temptation to say, okay, what's movement speed? Well, 2 miles in a half an hour. So just flip, go 2 miles, boom, right? Something like that. It's like, okay, they're already on their way. But in reality, if you think about it, I went to a reenactment this last Saturday, and each side had a force of about 30 men. It was a tiny reenactment. But even 30 men, just 30, and this here is like representing thousands, they still were kind of slow to, get up, get in line. It took, and granted, these weren't trained professional soldiers, but just 30 people, it was slow to get them to change anything. And get in line, get in line of march, and start firing, things like that. So imagine you've got 3,000 guys here, and you say all of a sudden, okay, now you're not in line anymore. Form up, get in column, start going that way. It's going to take a lot longer to do that. And so as umpires, rather than saying, okay, your next turn you're 2 miles away, you say, well, maybe the next turn it takes a full half hour just to get these guys in column, and then they're going to start going next turn. I think umpires don't do that often because it slows down the game, and they're trying to get to a conclusion and not play for 20 hours in a day. But a realistic play would be have a lot more friction, a lot more slowness and movement, so that players have to be much more thoughtful about committing their forces and changing orders and jerking their commanders around. Because if you're constantly changing what's going on, it should be very difficult to just keep moving troops to different places. So I'll stop ranting about that. Let me look at my notes real fast. So we've covered reconnaissance, force concentration, a little bit about center of gravity. For those who are unfamiliar, I guess center of gravity could be considered, if you have an army, I'll just use the Confederate army here. I just threw it all on here. This one's not very big, but let's say they're in line here for some reason. Something like that. I don't know why they'd be like that, but so where's the center of gravity of this force? This one's pretty easy. You can see they got a thin line here, thin line there, and then super concentrated right here. The center of gravity would be somewhere like that. That's where the headquarters is. That's where the main force is. It's the center of the army. That one's obvious. It could be more lopsided than that. Maybe you have an army whose strength's all on its left. let's say, and a very weak right. So the center of gravity would actually be more towards the left than the center. Um, so I guess that's what center of gravity is. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Um, yeah, I think I don't want to just keep ranting for the sake of ranting. I think I shared everything I have to share about that. I'm sure I'll have more thoughts after, and I'm sure other people have thoughts too. I'd love to hear them in YouTube and or Discord. What you think about maneuver, um, application of force, economy of force, thinking about center of gravity, those kinds of things. Um, I guess one thing I did want to mention about marching and maneuver that I haven't yet, so I'll bring that. I've seen this in a few games. I've seen it both ways. Sometimes there's a balance between spreading your forces out to march quickly and then having them all on run road just so they're concentrated. And I've seen the extremes of both to their own detriment. So let's say, again, you're the Union player and you got to go east to the enemy. One thing you could do is send your entire force along one road, and that way, you're nice and concentrated. But the problem with that is, let's say you make contact here, it could take hours to bring the rear of your column to the front and get your nice long line for battle. Whereas if you split along multiple roads, you will, rather than having one long column that's 3 miles long, you'll have 3 columns that are 1 mile long. And then when you make contact, each one can individually quickly deploy. That's good. You can also get too extreme where, if you got 10 different forces all along different roads, first of all, it's hard to coordinate that, especially in Kriegsspiel. But if you get too spread out like that, then the enemy can find where you're weak and attack, your weak point, and then your other forces are so far away that they can't come to assist. So there's a balance between the two. It completely depends on the scenario what's the best answer, but it's just something for players to keep in mind as you're deciding your routes of march and what you're doing. That was the last thing that came to mind. Okay, let me see what comments are out there. Achilles says great stuff. Thank you, Achilles. Oh, Otto's here. Otto, you have thoughts to share?
I was having trouble hearing from the back row, so I decided to come a bit closer to the
Okay.
stage.
I want to hear your thoughts, though. I mean, you've played in a lot of games and umpired a lot, so any additional, I don't know, you probably didn't hear the beginning of what I said, but any additional thoughts of what I have said?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. Especially the main thing is that it really there's a lot. All of this stuff really depends on the umpire. It's kind of an umpire's job to try to simulate all these realistic aspects and emphasize them. Like, for example, the importance of reserves. Like, if there is no, if all units can be moved around very easily, potentially, and if there is no difference between fresh units and units that have been fighting for hours, and the players are not going to be incentivized to keep any kind of reserve, for example. So it's really an umpire's job is a pretty difficult one because there is a lot to take into account, and I've tried to. That is something that I've been trying to focus on with my new Napoleonic system is to get all the cogs in the machine working.
Yeah. So
Like, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, so what do you put into your rules to help enforce that, to encourage players to have reserves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have some things that I've been doing for a long time, and other people have as well. But I got some new exciting stuff. For reserves, to emphasize their importance, there's cascading morale, which is like I guess a mechanic that it's often used in games, which is that when a unit, let's say that 3 units, 3 battalions are in a line, and if the unit in the center of the line becomes broken slash routes, so
Hmm.
men lose their will to fight and begin running away, the units next to that unit will also suffer a negative morale effect, so they become closer to getting routed as well. That's called a morale hit in my system. And then there's also something you pointed out, which is the maneuverability of units, and that sort of order, not delay, but whatever you want to call it. But basically, if, for example, if you give, I've written down that if a unit changes formation, it's going to halve that unit's movement speed for that 15-minute turn, and if you actually give them new orders, that's also going to halve their movement speed. And then there is also order delay. So if you are far away from a unit, that distance you are to unit is going to be subtracted from that unit's movement speed. So potentially, if you give someone orders far away, they're not going to be doing anything that turn. And one quite fun mechanic I've also recently used in just yesterday's game was that is something called action points, which is a kind of game turn. Doesn't really sound realistic, but it's to simulate that as a commander, there's only just so much you can do in a 15-minute time span. So, for example, each commander might have 2 or 3 action points, depending on what military officer they represent, to kind of simulate the difference between Napoleonic armies. So if you are an Austrian commander in 1809 in the middle of the reforms, you might be only able to, in the middle of a turn, to write a short dispatch or move somewhere or give orders. You need to like choose 2 of the 3 to simplify it. And yeah, for reserves, there's also another interesting mechanic that I found fun. And this is something that John, I got the inspiration from John. John had talked about a lot about men per mile in games, which is how deep formations should be and how many reserves there are. And there's actually, in real life, there is a sort of tactical straight advantage from having a reserve. So it's not necessarily just a grand scheme of things, like if something goes wrong, you're going to need a reserve, but it might actually even make the units that are in the front line to just fight better due to the fact that they have someone in the rear. Like the Romans, for example, had their Triarii in the rear and the Hastari in the front and the Principes in the middle. Well, I'm not too studied. I haven't studied ancient warfare much, but it's something that's been relevant in warfare all the time. So what I've done is, if a unit engages the enemy and doesn't have anyone behind them, that unit is going to automatically get a morale hit. So if you go into combat without making sure your soldiers feel a bit more secure due to the fact that they are being backed up by more friendly forces to the rear, they are going to become quite shaken quickly from engagement. So there are a lot of interesting things you can do to kind of emphasize the importance of reserves. It's really, you need to kind of decide to sometimes overemphasize things, perhaps to an unrealistic level, to get the whole picture more realistic, which is getting players to use deeper formations to make them more viable. So there's a lot of, you need to kind of choose what you want to represent.
Yeah. I use a lot of the same things that you do. I think those are all good ideas. Another thing I do is, let's say a unit routes, if if they've got reserves behind them, I usually have them kind of stop there behind the reserves where they feel safe, and that's where they'll recover. But if they don't have reserves, I just have them keep running to either where it makes sense another place or just really far away, kind of to penalize the lack of reserves there. So that's another thing I do to reward players for having reserves. But yeah, I like your. I haven't done the morale bonus for the reserves But I like that idea, and I may incorporate that, so that's useful.
Yeah, I recommend. That is very cool. That I also like the way you have people. You need actually a kind of rallying point. That being a reserve line to get you soldiers back to the fight. There's a lot of. It's interesting trying to bring like reserves relevant to like a shorter time span because games. If no one cares about reserves, games are going to last a very short time. So if you have reserves, they might not become relevant due to the fact that the game only lasted 1.5 hours in game time. But if you have something like that, that potential rear line kind of
Yeah.
negate a bonus. Well, I'm not sure if it's called a bonus since it just negates the fact that something you don't get a morale hit. It's more it makes reserves even more important in just like a in a short window.
Right. Yeah, that I've seen that in a lot of live games where by the time you make contact, you know you have like an hour or two left in the game or less, and so you're like the the thought of the player is okay. Well, I know the game's almost over. I might as well just throw everything I have at it, and who cares? But I do, I, and I've mentioned this. I've seen it's gotten better, and if the umpire does a good job, even if the game's called before the conclusion, they will recognize and reward the players that kept the reserves, even though it's kind of quote unquote less fun to do that because you're not fully committing. But the umpire should say, okay, well, the winner is the person who still has still has reserves to choose what to do with and reward that.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
The you need to kind
Uh,
of need to like yeah. Sorry, the you need to. It's like uh, uh, I wish uh, I wish we had maybe this. We could have maybe when we established the IKS, we could have made. Well, I wasn't exactly establishing IKS, but in the early days of the IKS, I wonder if we kind of emphasized instead of you need to win, you need to instead of like the idea of the game is to win.
mhm.
Instead, it's to you need to preserve as many lives of your soldiers as possible. So it kind of really gives another
Yeah, it turns it on its
viewpoint on the
head
whole.
and really helps the players have an economy of force. I like that, and I think it's. There's been a few games where players are encouraged or rewarded for keeping units alive, and I think that's a good way to do it as an umpire. Um, I know. For myself as an umpire and a player, I love winning or winners versus losers, which isn't the true spirit of Kriegsspiel because it's a learning exercise, and it's not necessarily about who won the scenario because no scenario is usually fair, but it's who did their best within the conditions of the scenario, and those players which handled their units well, kept reserves, and didn't waste their units unnecessarily should be the ones that are most rewarded and recognized. Um, Achilles made a comment. And Achilles, you're welcome to raise your hand, and I'll invite you to speak if you want. But he said the center of gravity is the location or capability which, if lost, makes continued resistance no longer practical. For example, a hill position that, if lost, would make holding the line not possible, or a crossroads, which would make the fighting in that location impractical. It can also be a capability that, if lost, means the enemy no longer has the ability to win. For example, if this take out the Soviets' artillery park, then it can't defeat you, stuff like that. And then still wearing a hat. Thanks for your comment. He said, a very interesting idea Otto discussed for the reserve morale penalty. I could potentially see it being adjusted for the Sengoku period Japanese warfare to force players to emulate the formation of large sone. Yeah, it's a good idea. I have not, in my ancients rules, I have not included that, but it's a good idea to give a bonus for having
Yeah,
reserves in the line.
yeah. I recommend it. Really makes like having a backline like a no-brainer. Like you actually have to have one, or you will just automatically do better in combat if you have one.
Yeah.
But I also one in addition to that, I at one point thought about maybe like instead of because currently the rule is that you don't get a penalty if you have a backline. But I was thinking that if you have a backline, you could actually be like get a bonus in combat. That was
Mm-hmm.
something I thought about. For example, like I had one like I wondered because Napoleon had like his Imperial Guard often in the rear lines of his soldiers, and the triaria of the Romans was there in the rear, chilling. I was thinking that maybe they had a sort of inspirational effect on the soldiers, but I think that might potentially emphasize that a bit too much when I talk to John. So, but that's an option possibly to keep in mind.
Yeah. I know just thinking about it, if I were marching in the battle, uh, whether ancients or Napoleonic times, I think my personally I feel more higher morale to know that there's a line of men behind me, there to support me in case my line falls or whatever.
Yeah, I was thinking like the difference between like currently you don't get a penalty